ever more restrictive political decrees. Many things have a different name now, and the rules are constantly changing. The goal of cancel culture is to make decent Americans live in fear of being fired, expelled, shamed, humiliated, and driven from society as we know it. The far left wants to coerce you into saying what you know to be false and scare you out of saying.
You're listening to the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. Join the conversation by emailing ideas@wpr.org and like us on Facebook at the Ideas Network.
Message they will never forget. Thank you. Joe Biden is weak. He takes his marching orders from liberal hypocrites who drive their cities into the ground while fleeing far from the scene of the wreckage. These same liberals want to eliminate school choice while they enroll their children in the finest private schools in the land. They want to open our borders while living in Waldorf compounds and communities in the best neighborhoods in the world. They want to defund the police while they have armed guards for themselves. This November, we must turn the page forever on this failed political class. The fact is, I'm here. What's the name of that building? But I'll say it differently. The fact is, we're here and they're not. To me, one of the most beautiful buildings anywhere in the world, and it's not a building, it's a home as far as I'm concerned. It's not even a house, it's a home. It's a wonderful place with an incredible history. But it's all because of you. Together we will write the next chapter of the great American story. Over the next 4 years, we will make America into the manufacturing superpower of the world. We will expand opportunity zones. Thank you, Tim Scott. Bring home our medical supply chains, and we will end our resilience for bad things. We will go right after China. We will not rely on them one bit. We're taking our business out of China. We are bringing it home. We want our business to come home. We will continue to reduce taxes and regulations at levels not seen before. We will create 10 million jobs in the next 10 months, and it'll be higher than that. We will hire more police, increase penalties for assaults on law enforcement, and surge federal prosecutors into high-crime communities. We will ban deadly sanctuary cities and ensure that federal health care is protected for American citizens, not for illegal aliens. We will have strong borders. And I've said for years, without borders, we don't have a country. Don't have a country. Strike down terrorists who threaten our people and keep America out of endless and costly foreign wars. We will appoint prosecutors, judges, justices who believe in enforcing the law, not enforcing their own political agenda, which is illegal. We will ensure equal justice for citizens of every race, religion, color, and creed. We will uphold your religious liberty and defend your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And if we don't win, your Second Amendment doesn't have a chance. I can tell you that. I have totally protected it. We will protect Medicare and Social Security. We will always and very strongly protect patients with pre-existing conditions. And that is a pledge from the entire Republican Party. Thank you, Kevin. We will end surprise medical billing, require price transparency, and further reduce the cost of prescription drugs and health insurance premiums. They're coming way down. We will greatly expand energy development, continuing to remain the #1 in the world and keep America energy independent. And for those of you that still drive a car, look how low your gasoline bill is. You haven't seen that in a long time. We will win the race to 5G and build the world's best cyber and missile defense, already under construction. We will fully restore patriotic education to our schools and always protect. We will always protect free speech on college campuses. And we put a very big penalty in. If they do anything having to do with your free speech, colleges have to pay a tremendous financial penalty. And again, it's amazing how open they've been lately. We will launch a new age of American ambition in space. America will land the first woman on the moon, and the United States will be the first nation to plant its beautiful flag on Mars. This is the unifying national agenda that will bring our country together. So tonight I say to all Americans, this is the most important election in the history of our country. There has never been such a difference between two parties or two individuals in ideology, philosophy, or vision than there is right now. Our opponents believe that America is a depraved nation. We want our sons and daughters to know the truth. America is the greatest and most exceptional nation in the history of the world. Our country wasn't built by cancel culture, speech codes, and soul-crushing conformity. We are not a nation of timid spirits. We are a nation of fierce, proud, and independent American patriots. We're a nation of pilgrims, pioneers, adventurers, explorers, and trailblazers who refuse to be tied down, held back, or in any way reined in. Americans have steel in their spines, grit in their souls, and fire in their hearts. There is no one like us on earth. I want every child in America to know that you are part of the most exciting and incredible adventure in human history. No matter where your family comes from, no matter your background in America, anyone can rise. With hard work, devotion, and drive, you can reach any goal and achieve every ambition. Our American ancestors sailed across the perilous ocean to build a new life on a new continent. They braved the freezing winters, crossed the raging rivers, scaled the rocky peaks, trekked the dangerous forests, and worked from dawn till dusk. These pioneers didn't have money, they didn't have fame, but they had each other. They loved their families, they loved their country, and they loved their God. When opportunity beckoned, they picked up their Bibles, packed up their belongings, climbed into their covered wagons, and set out west for the next adventure. Ranchers and miners, cowboys and sheriffs, farmers and settlers, they pressed on past the Mississippi to stake a claim in the wild frontier. Legends were born. Wyatt Earp, Annie Oakley, Davy Crockett, and Buffalo Bill. Americans built their beautiful homesteads on the open range. Soon they had churches and communities, then towns, and with time, great centers of industry and commerce. That is who they were. Americans build their future. We don't tear down our past. We are the nation that won a revolution, toppled tyranny and fascism, and delivered millions into freedom. We laid down the railroads, built the great ships, raised up the skyscrapers, revolutionized industry, and sparked a new age of scientific discovery. We set the trends in art and music, radio and film, sport and literature, and we did it all with style and confidence and flair, because that is who we are. Whenever our way of life was threatened, our heroes answered the call. From Yorktown to Gettysburg, from Normandy to Iwo Jima, American patriots raced into cannon blasts, bullets, and bayonets to rescue American liberty. They had no fear, but America didn't stop there. We looked into the sky and kept pressing onward. We built a 6 million pound rocket and launched it thousands of miles into space. We did it so that two brave patriots could stand tall and salute our wondrous American flag planted on the face of the moon. For America, nothing is impossible. Over the next 4 years, we will prove worthy of this magnificent legacy. We will reach stunning new heights, and we will show that the world, for America, there is a dream, and it is not beyond your reach. Together we are unstoppable. Together we are unbeatable, because together we are the proud citizens of the United States of America. And on November 3rd, we will make America safer. We will make America stronger. We will make America prouder. And we will make America greater than ever before. I am very, very proud to be the nominee of the Republican Party. I love you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you very much.
President Trump concluding a very long speech at the end of the fourth night of the Republican National Convention, with the crowd of more than 1,000 people on the south lawn of the White House now on their feet, applauding as he claps in response. Very few people in the crowd wearing masks. President Trump's speech made the case for another 4 years of his presidency. There are now fireworks going off in the background behind the Washington Monument. We're going to have a thorough analysis, a lot lot of fact checks and a discussion about what was in his remarks, but you can also find real-time fact-checking and annotations at npr.org/conventions, where we have a team of NPR reporters weighing in, experts on foreign affairs, COVID-19, politics, and the fireworks just spelled out Trump 2020. You're listening to live special coverage from NPR News.
This is special coverage from NPR News of the Republican National Convention. I'm Michelle Martin with R.A. Shapiro. We just heard a lengthy speech from President Donald Trump accepting the nomination for his second term.
Coming up, we will talk about all of it with analysis from our team and fact checkers. Stay with us.
Support for NPR's elections coverage comes from Noom, a personalized weight loss program based in psychology for helping people change their habits and conquer their goals. Learn more at Noom, Noom.com. And from Americans for the Arts.
President Trump has formally accepted the nomination from the Republican Party. The president spent much of his speech giving a very selective view of U.S. history, attacking his rival, sometimes in very personal terms, and giving a very robust and selective and in parts inflated view of his time in office. So we're going to start with members of our team here. We're going to go first to NPR political correspondent Mara Eliason. Mara, give us your take on the president's speech.
Well, it's kind of a head scratcher to me. I was expecting something different, maybe better than his usual comments, and I felt that so much in this speech we've heard him say before, and because he's so ubiquitous and is on TV all the time, I'm wondering if this kind of broke through in a way that his daily comments don't. Now, presumably he had a bigger audience. He clearly has chosen the law and order theme as the centerpiece of his attack on Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the destroyer of American greatness, he said. For 47 years, he took donations from blue-collar workers. He hugged and even kissed them, which I thought was a laugh line, but that was strange coming from a man who's been accused of sexual improprieties from more than a dozen women. But then he says, he told them he felt their pain and shipped their jobs to China. But most of the speech was about the mayhem, rioting, and looting that is going to come to your doorstep if Biden's elected. I don't know what this does. I thought the convention was pretty effective, pretty successful. But I was expecting something that was tighter and better argued than this.
Briefly,
that doesn't mean it didn't work. Yeah.
And you said that you did find the convention successful. Tell a little bit more about that.
Well, successful meaning that it conveyed the message they meant to convey. They wanted to address his deficits on character, race, COVID, and the economy. They addressed all of those. They had people validating him. He's not a racist. He's great for women. He did a great job on the pandemic. So they were able to get those messages out. And then there was Trump saying pretty much everything we've heard him say before. And he did talk about a second-term agenda. It was more of like a list of goals, similar to the first: more tax cuts, school choice, more tariffs, trade deals. I guess I was expecting something a little more inspiring.
I want to bring in NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith here, who is there at the White House and was watching this speech in the heat and humidity with the bullhorns and chants of protesters in the background. And Tam, I want to ask you to do some fact checks for us, but before we do that, you covered a lot of Trump 2016 campaign rallies. Obviously, because of the pandemic, he has not been able to hold those kinds of rallies. How do you compare what we saw tonight to the Trump that you saw on the campaign trail 4 years ago?
I don't think he had the same energy that I have traditionally seen. And in part, that's because he was doing teleprompter Trump instead of rally Trump tonight. At times this really felt like a State of the Union address rather than either a convention speech or a rally. The there was a very large crowd here, particularly by pandemic standards, at least about 1,500 people. And the fireworks...
You can hear the fireworks going off behind you, yes. Fireworks behind the Washington Monument, and they seem to be getting bigger, brighter, and certainly noisier on your line. But we can still hear you clearly, so go ahead.
Yeah, so, I would just say that he was not super high energy. He did not riff like he does. He didn't, bounce off the crowd like he often does. There were standing ovations, but it didn't have the energy.
Well, let's get into some fact checking, because there were a lot of statements he made that are not supported by the record. What stood out most to you?
Well, there were a number of things, but let's start with prescription drugs, because this has become something of a hobby horse for me. About a month ago, he signed 4 executive orders. Since then, he has been campaigning like they have taken effect. And they haven't. In fact, one of those executive orders still hasn't even been submitted to the Federal Register, even though he said it would be by this point. Just to explain, an executive order that isn't in the Federal Register is basically as good as an executive order that doesn't exist, and yet he's already acting like it's in place.
I also want to let listeners know we've clearly segued from fireworks to opera in the background. But the prescription drug prices point is important, because the Trump administration has been fighting the Affordable Care Act in court, and yet there are aspects of the Affordable Care Act that are very popular, and the Republicans have not offered a plan to replace it, right?
No. I mean, ever since they failed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act early in his presidency, and let's just say that he went through a long series of promises made, promises kept, but when it comes to health care, he cannot make those same claims. And that's right. Ever since they failed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, Republicans have not been able to offer a plan to replace it, even though President Trump has promised repeatedly, including about a month ago, that he would have a big, bold plan to replace, or a health care plan, and yet it's like it just keeps getting pushed out 2 weeks.
All right, NPR's Tamara Keith, thank you.
Let's go to Franco.
You're welcome.
Another White House correspondent. Franco, what stood out to you, particularly in the area of some of the issues that have been very central to the Trump administration? The issue of immigration policy, the issue of building a wall.
Support for WPR comes from Vernon Memorial Healthcare in Viroqua, offering in-office visits and virtual appointments to patients through video or televisit technology. More is at bmh.org.
Waldorf compounds and communities in the best neighborhoods in the world. They want to defund the police while they have armed guards for themselves.
It's a lot to unpack there, but it's, kind of a tough argument to make even on good days, but especially considering Joe Biden is far from a radical leftist. And I think most politicians or analysts on the left and right would agree to that. Frankly, it was a strategy that the Trump campaign had planned to use against Bernie Sanders, who himself described himself as a democratic socialist. But the Republicans had to kind of adapt when Biden won the primaries. Republican strategist Scott Jennings, he was actually on Morning Edition this morning, and he kind of argued that this is, something they can use, and that the argument, though, is that Biden is too weak and that he's too transitional to stand up to the radicals, and that Republicans say that are, basically running the party.
That's Rico Ordonez, White House correspondent. Ari?
Let's bring in NPR Scott Detrow, who has also been listening here. And Scott, it is interesting the way they frame Biden both as sort of a veteran creature of the swamp who has too stayed in the old political ways to do anything significant, while at the same time describing him as a puppet of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the left.
Right there, you can walk through topic to topic to topic, and President Trump has really struggled to effectively attack Joe Biden. Such irony, given the fact that this is someone who made his political name coming up with zinger, crystallizing insults for his political opponents. But you know, when it comes to the crime bill, this is the author of a crime bill that put repressive and policies in place. But he's also somebody who wants to defund the police. There's all of these things that, when you stack them up next to each other, it doesn't quite make sense as an argument.
I know you've also been looking closely at the claims in the speech about the response to the coronavirus. Tell us what you heard and what the facts show.
Yeah, one of the things that in recent days the Trump campaign has talked about is the idea that Joe Biden wants to shut the country down again. That was a response to a question that Biden gave to ABC News. He was asked, would he do that? And he said, if the doctors suggested it, I would take that suggestion. Because something that the Biden campaign talks a lot about is giving the experts a seat at the table, making the medical advice, the scientific advice front and center without putting politics in place.
It was so striking that tonight Trump said, we followed the science and Biden would just shut down the country, when in fact the opposite has been true.
And there were many instances in just the last few days alone of political pressure on government agencies when it comes to guidelines, when it comes to approving treatments for the coronavirus. The quick answer to the main approach that Biden wants to take with the coronavirus is a major expansion of testing, hiring thousands of people to do contact tracing, and putting a mask mandate in place. Those are all things that other countries have very successfully used to get the virus under much better control than we have.
All right, that's NPR Scott Detrow offering analysis of President Trump's speech on the fourth and final night of the Republican National Convention, capping off this event. More analysis to come. I'm Ari Shapiro with Michelle Martin, and you are listening to live special coverage from NPR News.
We're back to live special coverage from NPR News. I want to bring in Tim Mak now, NPR's Washington investigative correspondent. I want to note that you will have heard protests going on throughout the night. President Trump's speech was delivered outdoors on the White House South Lawn. Tim Mak was out covering those protests that have been going on that you've surely heard. Tim, briefly just tell us what you saw throughout the night.
Sure. So I'm standing right now in Black Lives Matter Plaza, right in front of the White House. You might remember it from previous protests, especially after the death of George Floyd. It's been a pretty jovial evening. Hundreds of people coming out and dancing, celebrating, protesting also the president. But it's been a generally pretty joyous mood, except at the very last few moments where you heard those fireworks. You heard here in Black Lives Matter Plaza a bunch of booing, a bunch of people expressing their disapproval.
That is NPR's Tim Mak. Tim, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Let's turn now to NPR science correspondent Richard Harris, who's going to do a deep dive with us into some of the president's claims about the coronavirus pandemic and what the facts have shown. Hi, Richard. Good to have you here.
Hi, Ari.
The president painted a relatively optimistic picture of where we are in the pandemic. Here's part of what he said.
We are meeting this challenge. We are delivering life-saving therapies, and will produce a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe even sooner. We will defeat the virus, end the pandemic, and emerge stronger than ever before.
All right, Richard, break that down for us. The president begins by saying we are meeting this challenge. By the numbers, how is the U.S. doing?
Well, we've heard all about the troubles that the U.S. has had bringing this epidemic under control here, and it still isn't under control. Consider this number: a reported 1,000 Americans die every 24 hours. So, yes, there have been some advances in drug development, treatments that shorten hospital stays and possibly save some lives, but, there's nothing so far that has been transformative. The caseload in this country is also on the decline, which is good news, but it's still higher than it was back in April when the epidemic hit New York City so hard. So the U.S. still has a really long way to go here.
And when you compare the U.S. to the rest of the world, the president implied that this country is doing much better. I mean, he said the case fatality rate is lower here than it is in Europe, which is a selective figure to use. Explain why he chose that number and what other numbers some might choose to look at instead.
Right, well, he has chosen one of the few statistics that seem to be better for the United States, but, by most other measures, the story is really quite different. The U.S. has had far more deaths than elsewhere, for example, and while Europe and other countries quickly brought the worst of this epidemic under control, the U.S. is still struggling to do that, and we're still feeling the economic impact, hurting millions of Americans. I'm still reporting from my basement here, so things are not back to normal, that's for sure.
He also talks a lot about the sheer number of tests performed in the U.S., which is something he often says and said again tonight.
That's right. The U.S. has had to run a lot of tests because the epidemic has been out of control here for so long, and more testing will be required as long as the disease continues to spread. And of course, we heard all about the trouble of getting the testing up and running, and the backlogs that until recently could stretch for a week or even longer. So, the testing story really is not a success story here.
And finally, his statement that there will be a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe sooner. How realistic is that?
Well, there are multiple vaccines being tested around the world at the moment. One of the most promising is actually from the University of Oxford in the UK. There are also several in China that are in advanced stages of testing. The US is also on this quest, and we're running tests here, or scientists here are, and what we can't really say is whether any of them will be proven safe or effective. We have to wait for those tests to be finished. Maybe we'll start seeing results in the fall, and fingers crossed, but, promising a vaccine now is really premature.
NPR Richard Harris, thank you for the fact check.
Anytime, Ari.
Well, we have a few more minutes, so we're going to take that time to hear from a member of the loyal opposition. Lily Adams is a senior spokesperson and advisor for the DNC War Room. She previously worked on the presidential campaigns of Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton. Lily Adams, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Obviously, there's a lot to talk about here. President Trump criticized former Vice President Joe Biden in some very personal terms at times, attacking him both personally and on matters of policy. What stood out to you?
I think what stood out to me is that, obviously you heard from him, as your reporters were aptly noting, a lot of lying. You heard a lot of fear-mongering. You heard a lot of attacks and divisiveness. But I will just say, for an hour-long speech, I was surprised that we really did not hear a comprehensive plan for COVID-19 that is still ravaging this country and has killed 180,000 people. We did not hear a plan to address the racial injustices in this country that so many folks want leadership on. We didn't hear a plan to actually deal with the millions of Americans who are out of work. We heard some promises there, but no actual plan. And frankly, you just didn't hear a coherent case for the American people to give him 4 more years. And he's really struggled with laying out a second-term agenda.
Do you think that will matter? I mean, the president may have struggled to lay out a second-term agenda, but he made it very clear that he feels that an administration led by former Vice President Joe Biden would be disastrous for the country. And he and other speakers today certainly drove that message home repeatedly. Whether their facts were accurate, their message was very clear. Do you think that message will resonate, particularly at a moment where people are still protesting in the streets?
Well, no, frankly, I don't think that's going to work, because I think that what folks expect from this president, when you're facing, crises on many fronts, from a pandemic to an economic recession to, again, a moral crisis about racial injustice in this country, they want a plan, they want leadership, they want a vision. And instead, what this president has, because he has no ideas and no plan, all he has are just attacks on the other side. That's all we're going to hear from him from now into the election.
Yeah, well, fear is a great motivator. I mean, you heard one speaker this week, Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron, said no one is excited about Joe Biden. So before we let you go, Lily Adams, we know that fear is a great motivator. Has Joe Biden done enough to motivate people who support him to come out and support him?
Well, I think absolutely, and I'll just say the enthusiasm that we saw last week around our convention, around the Democratic convention, not only for his candidacy, but also for the pick of Kamala Harris to be his vice president. You saw a convention that looked like America. You saw, record signups for volunteer shifts, record donations from grassroots donors who want to be a part of this campaign. We're feeling a lot of excitement on our side.
That's Democratic spokeswoman Lily Adams. She's a senior spokesperson and advisor for the Democratic National Committee War Room. Lily Adams, thank you.
Thanks.
And before we wrap up for the night, I want to bring back in NPR's Mara Liasson, who has been with us through many long nights. This is the last one, and ordinarily in a presidential campaign, we would see both candidates take off to hold huge rallies all over the country in swing states.
Right.
That's not going to happen. So what does the home stretch of this campaign look like?
That's not going to happen. Well, I think what happens now, Trump says he wants to hold events, live events with audiences, and you certainly saw one tonight, no masks and no social distancing.
Certainly, yeah.
A few masks, very few. What happens next, I think the debates are going to loom very large. They're the next big set-piece events. There are going to be 3 of them.
Plus
Donald
one vice
Trump
presidential debate, right?
Plus one vice president. He repeated his attacks on Biden. He said he was completely in the dark, doesn't have a clue. He's really made Biden into a doddering old guy who can't string sentences together. And he's lowered expectations for Biden. So it'll be interesting to see now. Sometimes the Trump campaign says, oh, well, actually, Biden is a great debater. But I think the debates are going to be extremely important. We'll see if the Biden we see in the debates resembles the Biden that Trump has painted. That's one thing. And then there are all these events that are going to affect the election. What happens to the coronavirus? Does it plateau and start decreasing? Does the economy start bouncing back? Is there a vaccine or not? He said tonight there's going to be a vaccine early next year and perhaps sooner. It's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future, but I predict that he will announce something about a vaccine before Election Day.
Just in our last minute, Mara, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump were so well known before these conventions. Do you think they actually moved the needle much at all?
Well, that's what I'm just really curious about what the focus groups and polls will tell us about how these guys changed things or didn't in these conventions. Biden has not gotten a bounce from his. After tonight, before Trump's speech, I thought, he's going to get a bounce. It's been pretty effective. Alice Johnson, amazingly powerful, moving validator for him.
The criminal
but after the
justice
speech,
advocate, yeah.
I think maybe he won't get a bounce either, and it's just going to be static, and it'll be trench warfare, and they'll fight it out.
That is NPR's Mara Liasson taking us out on our last night of the Republican National Convention. The crowds are emptying out of the White House, and soon we will empty out of our home studios and those of us who are here in person. So we are down to the final stretch of the 2020 election.
And it's almost midnight. That means there are almost 67 days until November 3rd. Until then, you can find all of our coverage right here and online at npr.org. Thanks to you.
This is Chapter a Day. I'm Norman Gilliland, reading again from Northland, a 4,000-mile journey along America's forgotten borders by Porter Fox, published by Norton in 2018. And Porter Fox has canoed the St. Croix River, which separates Maine from Canada, and then has gone over to the St. Lawrence, where he has hitched a ride on a Great Lakes freighter, the Algoma Equinox, captained by Ross Anderson. Chapter 4. Heightened security has been a hassle, but it doesn't keep most captains up at night. What worries them about the entire Great Lakes shipping industry these days is the health of the lakes themselves. A warmer climate across the Northland has made water levels in the lakes fluctuate radically. Lack of ice in the winter increases evaporation rates, which rain can't always make up for. The Great Lakes saw an unprecedented drop between 1998 and 2013, during which time regional conditions were wetter than average. Fall gales can evaporate 2 inches of Great Lakes water per week. Freighters are designed to fill canals completely after running just a few feet above the bottom. A 1-inch drop in water levels means a Great Lakes freighter has to shave 270 tons of cargo from its hold so it doesn't run aground. If water levels drop further, as climate scientists predict they will, shipping specialists say that freight companies will have to cut loads and profitability by up to 30%. When you're talking about hundreds of millions of metric tons of cargo annually, and more than 200,000 jobs, low water in the lakes could cripple the business and the region. A sudden rise in water levels in 2014, about 2 feet in Lake Superior and 3 feet in Lakes Michigan and Huron, brought the lakes to above average levels. It was one of the most dramatic shifts in recorded history and caught officials on both sides of the border by surprise. Some heralded the rebound as proof that the lakes were immune to climate change. The reality, though, is that a sudden change in either direction cost shipping lines and government agencies millions of dollars. An increase in midwinter rain and extreme spring storms leads to soil erosion and more silt in harbors and canals, requiring wide-scale dredging. Before the 1970s, it took 20 to 30 years for the lakes to see 7 feet of change. Now they can shift that much in 18 months. Isolation and boredom aren't the only danger on the Great Lakes, Captain Ross told me. He pointed to a chart on the wall and showed me locations of a few shipwrecks. Superior and Michigan are the most dangerous because they are the longest, giving storms enough fetch to create 2-story waves. Fronts flowing west to east in the fall are particularly rough. The lakes sit in a lowland between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians. Cold, dry air flows down from the north and meets warm, moist air coming up from the south. Add prevailing westerlies rolling off the Rockies, and you get a vortex of constant and dangerously unstable weather. Winds can blow 40 to 50 miles an hour and whip up waves 25 feet tall. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Paradise, Michigan, estimates that 6,000 ships and 30,000 lives have been lost on the lakes. The gale of November 11th, 1835, sank 11 ships on Lake Erie alone. The Matafa, a storm of 1905, sank or damaged 29 freighters, killed 36 seamen, and caused $6.5 million in damages. Storm losses in 1868 and 1869 led to the first national weather forecasting system in the U.S., initially managed by the U.S. Army Signal Corps using telegraphs in Great Lake port cities. The most famous wreck, the Edmund Fitzgerald, which sank in a November gale in 1975 with all 29 crew, went down a couple of hundred miles ahead of our route. A few miles upstream, the river widened to 5 miles across. We passed Chippewa Bay and entered Thousand Islands, New York, summer home to millionaires for a century and a half. There are 1,864 islands along the 50-mile stretch. Most have mansions or sleek modern houses on them. Many were retreats for business moguls and movie stars in the Gilded Age. Back then, a short train ride from New York City to Clayton, New York, left visitors a few steps from a ferry or a private launch that would take them to their house or hotel. I stepped onto the wheelhouse deck to see Singer Castle. 60-foot stone walls and terracotta roof tiles glowed in the late afternoon light. The water around Dark Island, which the castle sits on, was deep azure. Frederick Gilbert Bourne of the Singer's Sewing Machine Company built the fortress. It is a medieval revival. King LaSalle sold his land back to the priests at a handsome profit, bought 4 birch bark canoes, hired 14 men, and made plans to travel west with a little idea of where he was going or what he would do when he got there. His timing was good. The Jesuits were planning an expedition to the Ohio Valley at the same time and wrapped his mission into theirs. They hired the Seneca that LaSalle had befriended and a veteran soldier, Francois Dollier de Casson, to be their guides. To venture west of Montreal in the 17th century was a wildly dangerous thing. The terrain was rough, remote, and unmapped. If you got sick, you would probably die. Provisions included bags of dried maize and whatever the guides could hunt and gather. If supplies ran out, expedition members paddled all day without eating. Everyone slept on the ground, no matter their rank, hopefully next to a fire. If it rained, guides constructed rickety tents from overturned canoes, birch bark, and sticks. The journey was a moderate success. LaSalle paddled the southern shore of Lake Ontario, past the mouth of the Niagara River, where he heard the Great Cataract a few miles away, but did not see it. He continued to the western end of the lake, where the town of Hamilton, Ontario now stands. He faked a fever there so that he could separate from the Jesuits and paddled Lake Erie and the Ohio River. He explored as far west as the Illinois River, looking for the waterway that the Seneca had told him about. It was unclear if he made it to the Mississippi on his first trip west. He would on his next journey. In what became a pattern in his life, his maniacal drive pushed his men to mutiny near the river, and LaSalle made his way back to Lachine Rapids alone. Being an explorer in America in the 1600s meant being a politician as well. You couldn't simply head out and make a claim. Hundreds of charters, borders, territorial lines, and spheres of influence divided the Northland. LaSalle spent the next 5 years courting the new governor of New France, Louis de Bade-Comte de Frontenac, and securing a grant from the king to build a trading post at Cataraqui on the eastern shore of Lake Ontario. He built Fort Frontenac with stone ramparts, cannons, officers' quarters, and a forge, mill, and bakery. He constructed a small chapel watched over by 2 friars and cleared 100 acres of land where farmers grew crops and raised livestock and fowl. 2 military officers, a dozen soldiers, and a surgeon moved in. LaSalle created a village for a few French families near the lake and granted them farms. He convinced a band of Iroquois to settle there as well. His brash and manic way made it hard for Indians to tell whether he was a friend or a foe. 4 ships anchored on the lake were under his command as well, the largest a square-rigged 40-foot brig. LaSalle's vision of restoring the family name was realized at Frontenac, but he had no intention of settling there. He sailed for France and returned in 1677 with a patent to explore the upper country around the Great Lakes. His plan was to transport supplies for a 50-foot, 2-masted ship above Niagara Falls on Lake Erie, and then he would build the first sailing freighter on the 4 upper Great Lakes and carry furs from the western shores of Lake Superior back to the Niagara River. That fall, an advance team from Fort Frontenac sailed to the mouth of the Niagara River on Lake Ontario. The crew scrambled up the cliffs around the falls, found a building site on Lake Erie near Cayuga Creek, and contacted the local Seneca tribe. The Seneca lived along the western flank of Iroquois. The French and the Iroquois were enjoying a fragile peace, but the Seneca were not happy about the idea of Frenchmen setting up shop in their backyard. It was December and bitter cold by the time the builders arrived. Carpenters poured boiling water on the ground so that they could dig footings for a fortified home, and they fell old-growth red maple and eastern hemlocks for the ship. The snow was knee-deep, and temperatures dipped well below freezing. The Great Lakes act as heat sinks, cooling the shoreline in the spring and summer and warming it in the fall. Warm fall air blowing off Lake Erie around the Niagara Peninsula supports peach trees and grapevines. But when the first frost arrives, humid air becomes lake-effect snow. Lake-effect storms east of the Great Lakes dropped more snow than anywhere in America and left LaSalle's men to live and work in a continuous whiteout. LaSalle himself arrived a month later in a second ship carrying cables, bolts, anchors, cordage, cannons, and other supplies. After landing, the boat dragged anchor in a big blow and was wrecked. LaSalle and his crew dredged from a dory in below zero temperatures, trying to salvage as much cargo as they could. Most of the provisions were lost. Working in hostile territory in the middle of the winter, with primitive tools and no food, proved almost impossible. LaSalle's foreman, Henri de Tonty, a skilled one-handed Italian officer, was a taskmaster. Carpenters milled lumber while their Mohegan guides built wigwams and hunted game to keep them from starving. Friar Hennepin, the Recollet explorer who documented the journey, built a chapel and held services for the crew. The men hummed Gregorian chants and celebrated saints' days when they weren't shaping ribs and planking for the ship. 2 weeks after they began, the crew managed to lay the keel. In the meantime, LaSalle and 2 men walked 250 miles through 3 feet of snow with a single bag of cornmeal to sustain them. They walked to Fort Frontenac to resupply. Historians have speculated that LaSalle's near-demonic energy could have been a symptom of mental illness. His risk-seeking spirit, grandiose visions, and violent mood swings are common signs of manic depression. He did not get along with his men, who thought his erratic behavior endangered their lives. In their journals, they described him as secretive, paranoid, and headstrong. Tonty made great progress while LaSalle was away. When the Seneca saw the massive skeleton of the ship take shape in the stocks, they made plans to sabotage it. The Iroquois traded with the English and Dutch. Even with assurances from Tonty and LaSalle, they knew that a French shipping route through the upper lakes would devastate their business. They made a plan to burn the boat in its stocks, but someone tipped Tonty off and he launched the ship early in May of 1679. Le Griffon was a 45-ton bark with 2 masts. Nothing like it had ever been seen on the upper lakes. It was about 50 feet long and 15 feet across, with high gunwales and a lofty galley. Beneath the bowsprit, shipwrights had carved an intricate griffin design, the sign of the Frontenac family. The ship was armed with 5 cannons, and the crew lit them all off at the launch as a way of celebrating the ceremony. The show terrified and impressed the Seneca, who called the builders supernatural beings, Octocon. The crew spent the next 2 months outfitting the Griffon, rigging it with masts and sails and lines, and by the time LaSalle returned in July, the ship was ready to push off. 12 men dragged her to Lake Erie. They dropped anchor in a sheltered cove far upstream from Niagara Falls and waited for a following breeze. The wind turned on August 7th, and 34 men unfurled the sails and headed west on a broad reach. The crew was sailing uncharted waters that had been crossed only by a canoe. A birch bark canoe draws about 6 inches in the water The Griffon's keel likely reached at least 5 feet beneath the surface. Hundreds of underwater shoals and rocks, now marked by lighthouses, buoys, and charts, were invisible to the pilot. LaSalle used a rough map created 10 years before and sounded continuously with a lead line. The pilot passed Long Point, then the grassy shores where Cleveland and Toledo stand today. The Griffon reached the mouth of the Detroit River in 3 days, a 300-mile journey that would typically take a trader a week or 2 in a canoe. From there, the Griffon sailed north to Lake St. Clair and to the St. Clair River, and then waited 2 weeks at the southern end of Lake Huron for the weather to settle. Not one to take things slowly, LaSalle wanted to sail to the edge of Lake Huron on the Griffon's maiden voyage. The crew set out on the first calm day, but hours later a violent gale blew down the lake. The wind howled from the southeast day and night. Deckhands lowered the topmasts to keep them from breaking. They lashed sails to booms and let the boat drift for an entire day. At one point, the pilot fell to his knees and prayed. The crew followed, promising to build St. Anthony of Padua, the patron saint of sailors, a chapel if he rescued them from the storm. St. Anthony came through. The wind blew the Griffon northwesterly through the open water, past Presque Isle and Rogers City. When the wind died, the ship was a short sail away from a Jesuit mission on Mackinac Island, 70 miles northeast of Traverse City. Huron, Ottawa, and a dozen Frenchmen who were camped on Mackinac gawked at the ship as it approached. LaSalle put on a show and lit off the Griffon's cannons as 100 birch-bark canoes paddled out from the shore to see the spectacle. It was LaSalle's moment. He arrived on land wearing a plumed hat and scarlet cloak trimmed with lace. He attended mass at a small chapel and was welcomed by all, though most seethed at his accomplishment. Jesuits in black robes, couleur de bois, deerskin shirts and moccasins, Recollet priests, and even his own sailors prayed alongside him, while wondering what the madman's next move would be. With one trip, LaSalle had changed the fur trade in America and carved a commercial artery deep into the continent. He had also rendered the services offered by most traders at the camp obsolete. LaSalle departed for Green Bay, Wisconsin on September 12th to meet an advance crew that he had set out months before to gather furs. He found 15 of his men with the Potawatomi Indians, along with 12,000 pounds of pelts. It was a massive haul to move at one time, and to move it with such ease on a defensible floating fort was unheard of. LaSalle wanted to continue his mission to the Mississippi by canoe, and because Tonty was in Sault Ste. Marie arresting men who had abandoned the advance group, he was forced to send his pilot and Le Griffon back to the Niagara River without him. The ship set out on a calm day, but a violent storm blew in that night. LaSalle's fleet of canoes was driven up on a rocky inlet for several days. Le Griffon was never seen again. LaSalle speculated that the pilot had scuttled the ship and taken the furs. Others guessed that competing traders or Indians attacked it to save their business. Father Hennepin's journal states that the ship was lost in a storm, but many theories have circulated since. The wreck of the Griffon has never been found. LaSalle continued his journey south to the Illinois and Mississippi rivers and became the first European to navigate the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico. And once there, he planted a flag and claimed the region for the king. He called the territory Louisiana. Governor Frontenac had been replaced by the time LaSalle made it back to Montreal. The explorer did not receive a hero's welcome. His creditors wanted their money back and seized his property. The new governor accused him of threatening the fragile peace with the Iroquois. LaSalle's discoveries on the Mississippi were deemed insignificant, but the volatile explorer returned to the river anyway. He traveled to the Gulf of Mexico and set up a French colony in Texas, and a string of others reaching all the way back to Montreal. In the end, the man who had claimed a third of America for France died in an ambush carried out by his own men.